The first time it happened, I thought I was losing my mind. I'd barely stepped out the front door, fumbling with my phone and headphones, when I heard them. Soft, deliberate footsteps behind me. They were close enough that I froze mid-step, expecting to feel someone bump into me, but when I glanced back, the street was empty. I forced a laugh, shaking off the unease. Maybe it was the sound of my own footsteps echoing against the houses, or a neighbor's movement muffled by distance. Still, as I walked down the block, the footsteps started again. They weren't mine. Every step I took, they followed, perfectly timed but somehow off. They didn't echo, exactly. It was more like someone was mimicking me, staying just out of sight. I stopped, turning sharply to catch whoever it was. The footsteps stopped too, a beat too late. Nothing, just the empty street and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my hands were trembling as I stuffed them into my pockets. I didn't want to admit it, but for the first time in years, I was scared to keep walking. I stood there for a moment longer than I care to admit, scanning the empty street. A car was parked. A few houses down, its windows dark, a dog barked faintly in the distance. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just off. Finally, I forced myself to move. My legs felt stiff and my strides were shorter than usual, but I kept walking. The footsteps started again, faint but deliberate, trailing behind me. This time, I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it really was an echo. The pavement was uneven, the houses close together. Maybe the sound was bouncing off the walls in a weird way, but my gut told me otherwise. I decided to test it. Without breaking my stride, I suddenly veered to the right, stepping onto the grassy edge of the sidewalk. The footsteps hesitated just for a second before following. Scrape of soles against concrete turned faint, like someone was carefully matching my new path. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, my mind racing through every possibility.
Was someone messing with me? Following me for some sick joke?
I glanced at the houses around me, hoping to see someone step out, a jogger, a neighbor, anyone. But the windows were dark, and the curtains were drawn. As I reached the corner, I stopped abruptly, spinning around to catch whoever was behind me. Nothing. The street was empty, just as it had been before. I stood there, my chest heaving, and scanned. Every shadow, every flicker of movement. A bird flitted between two trees. A plastic bag rustled against a fence, but there was no one there. And yet, I could still hear them. The footsteps hadn't stopped this time. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were. Circling me now, soft and deliberate, like someone pacing in slow, measured steps. I didn't stay to find out more. My legs moved before my brain could stop them, carrying me as fast as I could run back toward my house. I didn't dare look back. When I finally slammed the door shut behind me, my lungs burning, the footsteps were gone. But the silence that followed was worse. I stood there leaning against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the silence inside the house pressed against my ears, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, I felt safe, like I'd left whatever it was outside, but as the minutes ticked by, I realized something terrifying. I couldn't be sure it had stayed out there. I turned the lock slowly, the soft click of the deadbolt almost deafening in the quiet. My hand shook as I reached for the light switch, flooding the entryway with the warm glow of the overhead light. It didn't help. The house felt different, colder. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded sharper. The creaks of the old wood floor louder, almost deliberate. I walked into the living room, trying to calm myself. The footsteps were gone. I hadn't heard them. Inside the house, and the logical part of me tried to take over. It was just stress, or maybe some kid pulling a prank, but deep down I knew better. I slumped onto the couch, rubbing my temples. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I'd barely caught my breath when I heard it again, a single faint thump coming from the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. It sounded like a footstep, but it was too soft, too far away. To be certain, slowly, I turned my head toward the hallway, staring into the dark stretch beyond. The doorway. Another thump, closer this time. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer, just silence. And then, as I strained to listen, I heard it, faint, deliberate footsteps echoing softly down the hall, getting closer with every second. My stomach turned to ice. I jumped to my feet, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy glass paperweight from the coffee table. My hands trembled as I inched toward the hallway, ready to throw the thing at whoever, or whatever, was there. "Show yourself," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching for what felt like hours. And then, from the darkness at the end of the hallway, I heard a voice, low, almost a whisper. "You can't run from me." My knees nearly buckled at the sound. It wasn't loud, but the weight of those words hit me like a punch to the chest. The voice was raspy, unfamiliar, and somehow pressing against my skin, burrowing into my ears. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer, gripping the paperweight so tightly my knuckles turned. White. Silence. I took a shaky step forward, holding my breath, waiting for something to move, to answer, to do anything. The hallway seemed endless now, the shadows shifting and stretching unnaturally. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker of movement, so fast I almost doubted I'd seen it. Something darted from one shadow to the next, just at the edge of the hallway. My blood turned to ice as I realized whatever it was, it wasn't hiding anymore. The footsteps started again, louder this time, echoing through the house as if they were coming from every direction. I spun around, my heart racing, but no matter where I looked, I couldn't see anything. The voice came again, closer now. "You let me follow you." "Leave me alone," I shouted, backing toward the living room. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep moving. The footsteps grew louder, relentless, chasing me. Paperweight, like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The shadows in the corners seemed to twist and crawl toward me, and the air grew colder with every second. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, and then, just as I thought I might collapse, everything stopped. The footsteps, the voice, the cold. The house fell silent, so quiet that the hum of the refrigerator sounded like thunder. I stood there, shaking, waiting for it to start again, but nothing happened. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, as I lowered the paperweight, I heard it, one last step, a single, deliberate step coming from right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just stood there frozen as the voice whispered in my ear, "You can't leave me now." The voice was gone, but its weight lingered in the air, pressing against my chest. My breath came in shallow bursts, my pulse hammering like a war drum. I couldn't bring myself to move. Every instinct screamed to run, but my body refused. I finally turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, looming behind me, but the space was empty. The living room, the hallway, everything was as it should have been. Except it wasn't. The air was wrong. It felt charged, heavier somehow, as though I wasn't alone. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer than they should, pooling in the corners and creeping up the walls. I set the paperweight down with trembling hands, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to believe that whatever had happened was over. But it wasn't. When I tried to leave the house the next morning, the footsteps followed me again. They started. As soon as I stepped outside, soft and deliberate, mirroring my every move, no matter where it went, down the street, to the grocery store, even into crowded spaces, they stayed with me. Always close, always just behind. I tried everything to make them stop, changing my route, staying indoors for days, but the moment I set foot outside, they returned. Sometimes I'd hear the whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You can't leave me." I began avoiding the world altogether. The thought of hearing those steps, of feeling that unseen presence was too much to bear. My house became my prison, each day bleeding into the next. But even inside, I wasn't safe. The footsteps crept into the walls, faint but persistent, like a distant echo that only I could hear. The voice would come in whispers late at night, low and accusing, taunting me with words I couldn't fully understand. "You brought this on yourself," it would say. "You let me follow." One night, desperate for answers, I sat in the living room and spoke into the shadows. "What do you want from me?" The room grew colder, the air sharper, and the voice answered as clear and chilling as ever. "I want you to remember." The memories came flooding back then, unbidden and vivid, the night it had all started. The shortcut I'd taken home years ago, the faint footsteps behind me, the soft cry for help I'd ignored. In my rush to get home, I'd told myself it wasn't my problem, that someone else would deal with it. I was wrong. The thing that followed me wasn't just a ghost or a haunting presence. It was the weight of my own neglect, my refusal to face what I'd done or failed to do. Now it was always with me. As I write this, I hear the footsteps again, faint but steady, pacing in the hallway just beyond the door. I don't bother turning to look anymore. I know I won't see anything. I've stopped trying to fight it, stopped trying to understand. It's part of me now, a constant reminder of the moment I turned my back on someone who needed help. And the worst part, I know it will never leave me. Because some footsteps follow you forever. Do you believe in ghosts, or could guilt manifest into something that feels real? Let us know your theories about Alex's footsteps in the comments below. The invitation came in an envelope so plain I almost threw it away. It had no return address, no stamp, just my name written in impossibly neat handwriting. I stared at it for a moment, wondering who could have sent it. When I opened it, I felt the weight of the card before I saw the words. It was thick and heavy, like it carried some kind of gravity. My stomach churned as I read the message, my name jumping off the page like a scream. "You were invited to the funeral of Maya Carter." I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. My funeral? The details were all there. The date, 3 days from now, and the location, a cemetery I'd never heard of. But it was the line at the bottom that sent a chill racing down my spine. Attendance mandatory. I laughed nervously, as if the sound would break the tension in the room. A joke, I told myself. It had to be. But the more I stared at the card, the more it felt intentional, too precise, too ominous. To be random. I placed the invitation on the table and stepped back, my hands trembling. Something was wrong. And deep down, I already knew it. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I couldn't look at it either. The neat, looping handwriting on the envelope haunted me, etched into my mind like a scar. I busied myself with chores, hoping to shake the gnawing unease creeping into every corner of my thoughts. By mid-afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing, just a bizarre prank or a mistake. But when I reached for my phone to check messages, I froze. The date on the invitation stared back at me, burned into my brain. 3 days from now, Friday. On my calendar app, Friday was blank. No appointments, no errands, nothing. My stomach tightened. It was rare for a Friday to be so open for me, as though the day had been cleared for something important. The thought made me laugh nervously again, but the sound rang hollow. By the evening, the air in my house felt heavier, almost stifling. I jumped at small noises. The of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards under my own feet. The invitation seemed to loom larger every time I glanced at it. I picked it up once, intending to toss it in the trash, but the weight of it in my hand stopped me. It was too heavy for a simple card. And then the phone rang. I jolted, nearly dropping the card as I grabbed the phone from the counter. The caller ID was blank. No number, no name. My finger hovered over the green button, but something told me not to answer. The phone rang 4 times, then stopped abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence in its place. A chill ran through me as I stared at the screen. I had a voicemail. With shaking hands, I opened the voicemail app and pressed play. Static. At first, just the soft hiss of static, like an old radio caught between stations. But as I listened, I swore I could hear something faint beneath it, a whisper, too distorted to make out. I held the phone closer, straining to hear. And then it came, low and unmistakable. Maya, don't be late. I dropped the phone, the voice still ringing in my ears. My heart pounded as I backed away, my gaze darting to the invitation on the table. It wasn't a joke. It couldn't be. And somehow I already knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The invitation was still on the table, a silent reminder of the looming date. The whisper from the voicemail echoed in my head, Mia, don't be late. I spent most of the day pacing the house, trying to convince myself to forget about it, but no matter what I did, the pull to investigate was too strong. By mid-afternoon, I caved. I typed the cemetery's name into my phone's GPS and grabbed my keys. The drive was uneventful, but with every mile, the tension in my chest grew tighter. When I finally turned onto the gravel road leading to the cemetery, my hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the wheel. The cemetery was smaller than I expected, tucked away in a quiet patch of woods. The air felt heavier the moment I stepped out of the car, like the place was holding its breath. Rows of gravestones stretched out before me, their shadows long in the late afternoon light. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet seemed to move on their own, guiding me deeper into the cemetery. And then I saw it, a freshly dug grave near the center, the dirt piled neatly to the side. A single chair sat next to it, and a headstone gleamed in the sunlight. My breath caught when I saw the name. Maya Carter. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The date beneath my name matched the date on the invitation, and below that, engraved in bold, precise letters, were 3 words. She didn't listen. I turned around, ready to run, but something caught my eye. The gates. It hadn't been there when I arrived, and the windows were too tinted to see inside. The wind picked up, carrying a faint sound that stopped me cold, a whisper, soft but insistent, weaving through the rustling leaves. Maya, don't be late. I ran to my car, my heart pounding. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting the black car to follow, but it didn't move. It just sat there, watching. I spent the next 2 days in a haze of fear and denial. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. Every sound in the house made me jump. The invitation sat on the table like a ticking time bomb, counting down to the inevitable. When Friday arrived, I told myself I wasn't going. I couldn't, but as the clock crept closer to the time listed on the card, I found myself standing by the door, my coat in hand. The words on the invitation rang in my mind. Attendance mandatory. I don't even remember deciding to go. It was like my body moved on its own, like something was pulling me. The cemetery was darker this time, the overcast sky casting deep shadows over the gravestones. The black car was waiting by the gates, just as it had been before. As I stepped into the cemetery, I heard them, soft whispers floating on the wind, calling my name. The grave was exactly as I'd left it, but this time, a small group of people stood around it. My heart stopped. They were all me. Dozens of versions of myself, each dressed in black, their faces expressionless. Some were younger, others older, but they all looked like me. They stood in a silent circle around the grave, their heads bowed. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. A shadowy figure stepped forward from the group. Its form was hazy, like it was shifting in and out of focus. When it spoke, its voice was low and resonant, cutting through the oppressive silence. Welcome, Maya. This is your chance to accept what you've ignored for too long. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. The figure gestured to the grave. This is not just your death. It is the death of the lies you've told, yourself. The death of the person you pretended to be. If you refuse to face it, you will be trapped. Here, forever reliving this moment. I shook my head, backing away. I don't understand. What do you want from me? The figure stepped closer, its form solidifying into something vaguely human. The truth, Maya. The truth you've been running from? Tears blurred my vision as memories I'd buried deep began to surface. The mistakes I'd made. The people I'd hurt. The promises I'd broken. The weight of it all crashed down on me, suffocating. This is your funeral, the figure said, its voice soft but commanding. But it doesn't have to be. The end. The end. It extended a hand toward me, waiting. My body trembled, torn between fear and the faint hope that this was my chance to make things right. The figure's hand hung in the air, waiting. The whispers around me grew louder, insistent, a chorus of voices that all sounded like my own. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my mind racing, with fragments of memories I didn't want to face. I didn't want to take its hand. I didn't want to face what I'd buried, but deep down I knew I had no choice. If I didn't, I would be stuck here, trapped in this endless haunting moment. My fingers trembled as I reached out and clasped the figure's hand. It was cold, impossibly cold. And yet it felt solid, real. The moment our hands touched, the world around me shifted. I wasn't in the cemetery anymore. I stood in the middle of my childhood bedroom, the familiar scent of dust and old books filling the air. The walls were lined with posters I'd long forgotten, the bed neatly made with the same quilt my mother had sewn years ago. On the desk, a photo album lay open. I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages. Each picture was a moment from my life, birthday parties, graduations, quiet evenings at home. But the faces in the pictures weren't smiling. They were blank, expressionless, like they had been drained of life. The whispers returned, softer now but clear. Look closer. I turned to the final page and froze. The photo wasn't from my past. It was from the cemetery. It
Showed me standing at my own grave, surrounded by those eerie copies of myself. The photo felt
alive, the figures in it shifting slightly, as if they were waiting for me to act. The voice of the shadowy figure echoed around me. You've spent your life pretending, running from your mistakes, hiding from the truth. This is your last chance, Mia. Face it or stay in the shadows forever. Tears streamed down my face as the memories came flooding back. The friendships I'd let crumble, the family I'd distanced myself from, the promises I'd broken, every excuse I'd made, every time I'd chosen to ignore the consequences of my actions came rushing back in painful clarity. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I didn't mean to. No more excuses, the figure interrupted. Its tone wasn't cruel, but firm, final. Accept what you've done. Accept who you are. Only then can you move forward. I closed the photo album, the weight of it almost unbearable, and turned back to the figure. I'll face it, I said, my voice trembling but resolute. I'll make it right. The figure nodded, and the world shifted again. I was back in the cemetery. The crowd of my doppelgangers had vanished, the whispers gone. The grave was still there, but the headstone now bore different words beneath my name. She chose to change. The shadowy figure stood by the grave, its form fading like smoke in the wind. This isn't the end. Maya, it said, it's the beginning. Don't waste it. And then it was gone. I woke up in my bed the next morning, the sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but the weight in my chest told me otherwise. The invitation was gone, and so was the voicemail. But the memories were still there, vivid and unrelenting. That day I started making changes. I reached out to old friends I'd pushed away. I called my family, apologizing for years of silence. I began sorting through the mess of my life, one step at a time. The shadow of the cemetery still lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the choice I'd made, but I carried it with me like a badge, proof that I could face the truth and start again. One evening, as I stepped outside to watch the sunset, A cool breeze swept past me, carrying a faint whisper, "Don't be late." But this time, it didn't scare me. It was a reminder that life was fleeting, and I wasn't going to waste another second running from it. Life is fleeting, and sometimes it takes a wake-up call to truly start living. Tag someone who needs to hear this story and discuss how they'd react. I bought the house on impulse. It was old, charming, and cheap. Too cheap. The realtor had shrugged when I asked why, muttering something about needing repairs and a lot of character. At the time, I didn't care. I needed to leave my old life behind, and this house seemed like a good place to start over. On the first night, the quirks of the house didn't bother me. The creaky floors, the faint draft from the windows, the faint smell of lavender. It all felt like part of the charm. It wasn't until I walked into the hallway that I noticed something was wrong. The mirror in the hallway was large, ornate, and old. I didn't pay much attention to it until I passed by and caught a glimpse out of the corner of my eye. Only there wasn't a glimpse. I stopped, turning back to the mirror. The hallway behind me was perfectly reflected, but I wasn't there. My chest tightened, and I stepped closer, waving my hand in front of the glass. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was some kind of optical illusion, but deep down I already knew this wasn't normal. I stayed in front of the mirror, my hand frozen mid-air, waiting for something to change. It didn't. The hallway behind me was perfectly reflected, the faded wallpaper, the low light from the single bulb above, even the slightly ajar door to the guest room, but I wasn't there. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. The mirror seemed old but not damaged, no cracks or distortions that might explain what I was seeing, or rather, not seeing. Answers. Maybe the antique glass played tricks on reflections, or maybe I'd positioned myself at some weird angle that wasn't visible. "Stop overthinking," I muttered under my breath. My voice sounded louder than it should have been. The empty hallway, almost as if the walls absorbed it and threw it back at me. I stepped back, still staring at the mirror. My reflection didn't appear, but something else did. Faint fleeting blur in the corner of the glass. It was so quick I wasn't sure I'd seen it at all. That was enough. I turned away, forcing myself to walk to my bedroom. The sound of my footsteps against the creaky floor seemed louder now, like they were being amplified. As I passed the smaller mirror on the wall near my room, I didn't even look at it. Once inside my bedroom, I closed the door firmly behind me. I didn't lock it, but I pressed my back against the wood as if that would somehow stop my growing unease. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of old glass, my overactive imagination, but the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. In the morning, I resolved to put the whole thing behind me. I wouldn't let one strange experience ruin this new chapter of my life. Armed with a cup of coffee and a deep breath, I walked back into the hallway, determined to prove to myself that everything was fine. The hallway mirror was just as I'd left it. I walked straight toward it, half hoping my reflection would reappear, and I could laugh at how ridiculous I'd been. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. The reflection was there this time, but faint, blurry, like it didn't quite belong. It wasn't just faint, though something about it was wrong. My head tilted to the left, but the reflection didn't follow. Immediately, it lagged as if thinking about what to do before catching up a second later. My hand trembled as I raised it in front of the glass. The reflection copied me, slowly, like a sluggish puppet. I stumbled backward, my coffee spilling onto the floor. I couldn't stay in front of that mirror any longer, not knowing that whatever I'd seen was almost me, but not quite. That's when I decided to call someone, anyone, who might make sense of what was happening. But as I reached for my phone, I noticed it sitting on the entryway table, directly in front of another mirror. I didn't want to go near it, but I had no choice. I stepped into the entryway, feeling the air grow colder the closer I got. My reflection was nowhere to be seen in this mirror, but when I picked up the phone, I swore I felt eyes watching me from inside the glass. It wasn't just the mirrors that were off, it was the house itself. I stood there in the entryway, gripping my phone tightly, the chill from the mirrors crawling across my skin. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too heavy, like it was holding its breath. My gaze darted between the mirrors, each one a blank surface reflecting nothing of me. My hand trembled as I unlocked my phone and called the realtor. The line rang once, twice, then went dead. I stared at the screen in disbelief. No dial tone, no static, just silence. "Great," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Before I could decide what to do next, a soft creak echoed from deeper in the house. My breath hitched. It was the sound of wood shifting, slow and deliberate, like someone adjusting their weight on the floorboards. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. Another creak followed, louder this time, and it was unmistakable. It was coming from the hallway. Clutching my phone like a lifeline, I forced myself to move. My bare feet felt like lead as I crept toward the source of the sound. When I reached the hallway, the air felt colder, thicker. My eyes darted to the mirror, and my heart stopped. It had moved. The hallway mirror, which had been perfectly centered on the wall, was now tilted at an angle, its edge pressed against the floor as if it had been dragged. I froze, my chest tightening. I hadn't touched it. How could it have moved? I took a shaky step closer, peering into the glass. The hallway behind me was reflected, dim and shadowed, but still. No sign of me. Then the glass shifted. It was subtle, a faint ripple across the surface, like a pool disturbed by a pebble. And just for a moment, I saw something, a shadow flickering deep within the mirror. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My pulse thundered in my ears as I ran back to the living room. I slammed the living room door shut behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, my thoughts racing. The mirror had moved on its own, and whatever was inside it, I didn't want to know. The room was eerily silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I glanced around, searching for something, anything, that would make me feel safe. My eyes landed on the large floor-length mirror in the corner, covered with a sheet. Except it wasn't covered anymore. The sheet lay crumpled on the floor, and the mirror stood bare, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. My stomach churned as I realized my reflection wasn't there. I moved toward it slowly, my heart pounding harder with each step. The closer I got, the more the mirror seemed to shift, its glass darkening like storm clouds rolling in. And then I saw it. My reflection appeared faint and distorted, but it wasn't me. The figure in the mirror stood perfectly still, its head tilted to one side. Its eyes were sunken, its lips twisted into a faint, hollow smile. "Why are you running?" the reflection said, its voice soft but piercing. I stumbled back, clutching the side of the couch for support. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The lights flickered and the air grew colder. The mirrors around the house seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration that made the walls feel alive. The reflection moved again, raising a hand to press against the glass. "You can't leave," it whispered, its tone almost mocking. The house began to groan, the sound of wood shifting and creaking echoing from every direction. The mirrors in the room vibrated, their surfaces rippling like water. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp from the side table, and hurled it at the floor, length. Mirror. The glass shattered with an ear-splitting crash, shards scattering across the floor. For a moment, the humming stopped. The house fell silent. But as I stared at the shards of broken glass, my stomach twisted. Each piece reflected a version of me, dozens of faces staring back, their expressions blank and lifeless. And in every reflection, I was smiling. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow and deliberate. I didn't wait to see what was coming. Grabbing my car keys, I bolted for the front door, yanking it open with a strength I didn't know I had. I ran to my car, not daring to look back at the house, but as I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of the rear view mirror. My reflection wasn't there. I drove for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The empty road ahead blurred as tears filled my eyes. I couldn't get the image out of my head. The shards of glass, those reflections, the hollow smiles staring back at me. The rearview mirror remained empty. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't. Ignore the growing dread in my chest. When I finally reached the motel on the edge of town, I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment, staring at the darkened windows of the room I'd rented. My body refused to move, paralyzed by fear that whatever had been in that house might have followed. Me. I forced myself out of the car, grabbing my bag and rushing inside. The motel room was small and plain, a single bed and a desk with a cracked mirror hanging above it. I covered the mirror with a towel before collapsing onto the bed, my body trembling. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds. For a moment, I thought, maybe I'd imagined it all, that the house, the mirrors, everything had been a vivid nightmare, brought on by stress. But then, I checked my phone. The last photo I'd taken, of the hallway mirror the day I'd moved in, was different now. The image wasn't blurry anymore. Instead, it was clear, and in the reflection, I could see myself, standing in the hallway. Except it wasn't me. The figure in the reflection wore the same clothes I'd been wearing that day, but its eyes were empty, its face twisted into that same hollow smile. I dropped the phone, my stomach churning as the memories came flooding back. The reflection wasn't just watching me, it had been waiting for me. I left town that day, abandoning the house and everything in it. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? For weeks, I avoided mirrors entirely. I couldn't bear to see my reflection, afraid of what might be looking back, but the feeling of being watched never left. One afternoon, while walking through a crowded market, I passed a shop window. I couldn't stop myself from glancing my reflection. It was faint, almost translucent, but it was there. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. And then it smiled. Not my smile, its smile. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but when I looked again, the reflection was gone. Just an empty window pane staring back at me. I don't know what the house did to me or why it let me leave. All I know is this: the mirrors don't need the house to find me anymore. They never really did. Because wherever I go, they're waiting. What would you do if the mirrors in your home stopped reflecting you? Share this story with someone who loves psychological horror and see what they think.